Okay, so we are here tonight to talk about the history and ecology of the eastern coyote. A lot of us are pretty familiar with coyotes. Some of us might know some, but be looking to learn about more. This is a really good time of year to learn about coyotes because it is pupping season. So I'll talk a little bit more in depth later on about kind of the timeline that coyotes go through throughout the year. But right now is when we often hear an uptick in reports on seeing coyotes or what people might interpret as unusual behavior. So I think it's a really good time to have these conversations so we know what to expect. We know how coyotes should behave this time of year, especially when they have pups. And a lot of us are home and we're utilizing outdoor space a lot more, which is great. But that also, of course, means we might encounter wildlife a little bit more frequently. So I do have my email on this slide, but I will put it in the chat at the end. But if anyone wants to jot it down really quickly, if you can't stay till the end, then you have it here. So hopefully some of you guys have actually been to the Wolf Conservation Center. We are closed now, unfortunately through June, but we do have online learning programs. So if any of you guys have young kids that are in classes, feel free to reach out to us. We're doing programs that way. If you yourself are a teacher, then you can schedule something with us as well. That's my little plug. Okay, now I'll get started. So I am going to start by just talking about kind of general things first. So basically getting an idea of the animal that we're talking about, the eastern coyote, and then we'll get more into the kind of nitty-gritty of it. So the eastern coyote, they are about the size of a border collie. They're actually much smaller than people tend to think. People often think that they're larger, maybe the size of a German Shepherd. That's kind of the most common comparison we get when we get phone calls. People will say, you know, I saw a coyote in my backyard. They're bigger than my German Shepherd. They must be 90 pounds. And in fact, they're actually much smaller than that. So on average, they weigh 20 to 45 pounds. They're significantly smaller than people tend to think. But they're really good at appearing larger than they actually are. They have very thick fur, especially in the winter. They have really long legs. And if you think about it, it's a pretty good idea to appear to be a larger animal without actually having to eat like a larger animal or occupy the space a larger animal might occupy. So kind of being able to trick other potential animals around them into thinking that they're bigger and that you don't want to mess with them, that's going to be a really good adaptation. Their appearance will really vary. And this also kind of contributes to their cases of mistaken identity. So this picture here shows pretty common coloration when we think of what a coyote looks like, that kind of tawny brown, grayish fur, really thick tails, but they can come in any color. We'll see them completely brown. We'll see them black in some areas. I've seen coyotes that are kind of red in color, and there's actually a few that live just on site at the Wolf Conservation Center, and they're completely blonde. And that's actually, we've seen it get passed down through a few generations. So they really do vary. They're also kind of easily identifiable by their tall, pointy ears and their fluffy tails that they usually carry straight down, whereas when we see dogs walking around, they tend to carry their tails up in the air. So this is just a chart that I've put together so we can get sort of an idea of the sizes of these different animals. So we have our typical house cat. They're usually 8 to 10 pounds. I've definitely had bigger cats than that, but that's the typical average. Coyotes, 20 to 45 pounds. I put a Labrador Retriever in here because it's a breed of dog that a lot of us are just kind of generally familiar with. They're usually 55 to 80 pounds. And then gray wolves are 80 to 120 pounds. So the Wolf Conservation Center, in case you guys aren't aware of where it is, we're in northern Westchester. We're in South Salem. I know that this program was kind of geared toward Weston, but I'm sure we have people from all around. So we're not terribly far from Weston, but I'm saying kind of giving us a sense of geography because I want to point out that we actually don't have any wolves in the Northeast any longer. And that's not the only time you're going to hear me say this throughout this program. I end up saying it a few times. So if you are seeing kind of a wolf-like animal in your yards or out on your hikes, what you're seeing is an eastern coyote. Unfortunately, wolves have been eradicated from the Northeast, but you can learn all about that from the Wolf Conservation Center, our typical wolf programs. But if you were somewhere maybe out west, maybe Yellowstone, where both gray wolves and coyotes did occur, just their size alone would be a really good way for you to differentiate which animal you were looking at. And then if you couldn't really tell, you would refer to a lot of other secondary characteristics, but I'm not going to get into that today. So this image is photoshopped. I always try to get that out immediately before people kind of freak out. So this is a compilation of 3 photos. So we have me walking past the camera. This is a trail camera. So if you're not familiar, a trail camera is a really good tool for wildlife research. It's also a lot of fun if you have an area in your backyard where you can set one up. It's a really interesting way to see what kind of animals occupy your yard or use it when you're not around. So this camera is motion censored. So if it senses a change in heat, so, you know, a warm-bodied animal and movement, it'll start to snap photos and videos. I was setting this camera up in a gentleman's backyard in South Salem. He had reached out to us because a deer had died in the woods right behind his house. We're not exactly sure what happened, but she might have gotten hit by a car and kind of stumbled her way in there. It is extremely unlikely that coyotes actually killed her. That is a real big misconception. Coyotes really aren't very good at taking down healthy adult deer. If they are eating deer, and I'll talk about their diets a little more later on, but when they are eating deer, it's typically from scavenging. They might be able to take down an adult deer if they're already injured or really sickly, and they're basically heading towards death anyway. But you can kind of see the deer leg, this was all that was remaining, right behind that first coyote's back leg. And so I went out there and I set up this camera. It's tied to a tree because we wanted to see what kind of wildlife activity was visiting this carcass. The homeowner had sent us a photo of a coyote eating the deer carcass, and just 10 feet behind that coyote was a bobcat just waiting her turn, which was really exciting because they don't often, you know, interact, but clearly it was just a very peaceful interaction. They were just kind of simply looking for a meal and being patient about it. So I walked in front of the camera because I was training an intern and showing them how it worked. But then, so that timestamp at the top, 11:27 a.m., that's when I walk by. The coyote that's right behind me, he's presumed male. He's what I would consider actually a kind of large coyote. He walked by just 2 hours later. And so that actually lent this to be a pretty good, easy Photoshop because the light was really similar. So he's just cut out of that image and pasted onto this other one. His size is not changed. His position is not changed. That's exactly where he was in the photo. And I spliced this together because I thought it was really interesting to see their size comparison. So you can see he's really just above my knee. And again, I would consider him to be above average in terms of his size. The female behind him, presumably his mate, she's much more typical, and I would estimate that she's probably 25, 30 pounds. She's not very big at all. So I just thought this was interesting so we could kind of see it. Plus, you know, it looks like I'm the leader of a coyote parade, so that's always fun. So coyote range. They're found in every U.S. state except for Hawaii. They first arrived in the Northeast in the 1930s, presumably by way of Canada, so they originated out west. The eastern coyote is a subspecies. Coyotes did originate out west, and they were able to migrate eastward when, unfortunately, people did begin to eradicate wolves from the landscape. So there were many kind of government implemented and private landowner implemented eradication campaigns to remove wolves and lots of other large carnivores from the landscape. And that is partially why the Wolf Conservation Center exists. We're trying to save those species from the brink of extinction. But in their absence, wolves would naturally be competition for coyotes. And when they're removed from the landscape, suddenly there's all this vacant and really great territory available. So coyotes who originated out west were then able to expand their range eastward naturally over time. So they just kind of gradually made their way here, and now they live again in 49 out of our 50 states. And we know they can live pretty much anywhere. They are really well known for how adaptable they are. So rural areas, of course, they live in the suburbs, they live in many parks, and we're even seeing them in pretty much every major city in the US. And the first known coyote in New York City was spotted in 1946. I say known because who knows which, if there were coyotes before her, I would I would say probably. She was unfortunately hit by a car, but they did erect a statue in her honor in one of the smaller parks. So I think that's just a nice note. So this shows you kind of their presumed range expansion. So this was a map. Hopefully this is actually moving on your screens. If not, I'll still just describe it. But this was made by a biologist, Roland Kays, who studies coyotes. So you can see each color is a decade. So it starts in kind of 1900 in red, and that's primarily the West and Midwest. And then each color, as it gets lighter and goes through the spectrum, kind of moves a little bit more east, a little bit more north, and actually some into Central America. So we're really seeing their range expansion that way. And it seems like for the most part, they went up north and then came down through Canada. So for their general background, we classify them as carnivores, but they're actually much more omnivorous. So coyotes are really known for being generalists. They're not very picky, and that's part of why they're so successful living in all these different places, because they don't have to adhere to one particular habitat type or one particular diet. They'll eat pretty much anything that's available, and we will see a lot of diet changes depending on what's seasonally available. So in the summertime, we'll see a lot more fruit in their diets. The winter, they might be scavenging a bit more, so you might see more deer, you might see more small mammals. Springtime, they might be eating fawns. The fawns are a little bit more vulnerable when they're first born, so that can be a high portion of their diet. But year round, we're going to see a lot of rodents. We might see rabbits and things like that. Communication, so scent marking, they are territorial animals. So just like, when we're walking our dogs, they're going to be peeing on everything. Coyotes will scent mark as well. And they're really led by their noses. So it's a great way to communicate to other coyotes and other animals in the area that this area is occupied, it's claimed. And not only that, if it's a fresh scent, that means it's frequently patrolled. So that's a really great signal to those other animals to stay out unless they're looking for trouble. And I'll talk about this later as well, but scent marking can be peeing on things, it can also be pooping on things, and that's a really great way to indicate that this area is occupied, and so we can use that actually in research as well. Body language, so we're familiar with a lot of this, but that can be whether or not they're making eye contact with another animal, their ear position, if their fur is raised or not, if their tail is raised, baring their teeth. A lot of this will look really familiar from our companion animals. And then vocalization is, of course, their most famous form of communication. Howling, we'll hear that a lot. Coyotes have a really unique kind of howl. They actually do sound very different from wolves. They're really high pitched. They'll yip a lot. They'll bark, and they are really known for, again, kind of advertising as if there were way more coyotes in an area than there actually are. So coyotes will actually change the pitch of their howl. They kind of have a bit of a hollow sounding howl, and changing the pitch and kind of sounds that they're making really frequently kind of throws that sound, and it makes it sound like there are many more animals in that area than there are. So people, when they reach out to us and say, the other night I heard coyotes in my backyard and it sounded like there must have been 12 of them, I would guess, obviously I'm not there, I can't exactly confirm, but I would guess it's closer to maybe 3 individuals. So they're really impressive that way. Activity, so they're not strictly nocturnal. This is another common misconception. Coyotes are primarily crepuscular, which means that they're most active at dawn and dusk, and that's typically when their prey is most active. But if we're seeing coyotes out and about during the day, that does not mean there is anything wrong with them. It doesn't mean that they have rabies or they have distemper. Again, they're generalists, and they're going to be active when there's food available. So we will see that change seasonally when, they might have pups. Maybe wintertime we'll see a little more activity, things like that. But just because we see them out during the day does not mean there's any cause for concern. And then their family life, they actually mate for life. Coyotes are monogamous. They have compared coyotes to other monogamous species like Arctic foxes and a lot of bird species. And studies have found that given the chance to philander, a lot of those other species will seize that opportunity. And coyotes actually remain very, very faithful to their mates. So they do mate for life. They are incredibly faithful. And they have a really strong family structure. So typically the male and female, the adults, we might call them the alpha pair. They're the breeding pair, and they're the core of the family group. They maintain their population really well because no other individuals in that group are permitted to breed. So we often hear about coyotes breeding exponentially, that their populations are getting out of control, and that's just not true. Only that breeding pair in that family group is actually allowed to breed. If you have an individual in that family that's looking to breed, they actually have to completely leave that territory, strike out on their own, find their own mate. And so that actually helps to maintain the population in a given area at a size that's going to be supported by the resources. So you're not going to see these coyote populations really explode. So a year in the life of a coyote. So I do think it's important that we're kind of familiar with how their lives change throughout the year, because again, that kind of helps us to be a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more familiar with their behaviors, and maybe be able to interpret what's going on if we do have encounters. So January to March, so this season just ended. This is courtship and mating. So even if we do have a monogamous pair, they're still going to go through some courtship behaviors. And then if you have some single coyotes out there, this is when they're going to be locating some other eligible individuals. March to April is when pups are born. So their gestation period, or how long the coyote is pregnant, is about 62 days, so just 2 months. So that's a very quick turnaround time. Litter sizes on average are 4 to 6 pups, but that will of course vary depending on how many resources there are available. Unfortunately, only about 50% of coyote pups do survive to their first birthday. So that's why they will sometimes have a larger litter size, maybe about 6, to hopefully increase the odds. And then they'll have typically their older offspring from previous seasons might actually stick around, and they kind of act as babysitters. They're sort of helpers, and they help the parents to defend the territory, hunt for food, and socialize the little pups. And that's a really important role. They teach them how to play, and through that play, they learn how to hunt for themselves, how to defend themselves. They really learn how to be a coyote pup. And again, some of this kind of contributes to how successful they are as a species, because they do have this whole family structure kind of looking out for one another, whereas lots of other species, might be left with just the female. She might be the only one raising the offspring, or some species just, lay their eggs and leave. So these animals are really, really successful because they do have such a solid structure. And then May to August, so we're kind of in that season right now, this is pup rearing. It's pup season. So pups will typically be in the den for the first 4 to 5 weeks of their life. So, some might be born right now. Some are maybe already about a month old. Once they're kind of this old, they're going to be moving around. They're a little bit more mobile. They are born blind and deaf, so they are really dependent on their parents in the beginning. But once they hit, 5, 6 weeks old, they're going to be starting to move around a little bit better. They're going to be starting to wean, so they'll stop drinking as much of their mother's milk and start actually trying solid food. And again, they're going to be playing a lot more. So around 7 weeks is when they'll start to abandon the den, and they might actually follow the family a little bit better. So we've had people reach out to us and say, it seems like there's a coyote den on my property. I'm seeing these pups playing in the yard or playing in the woods. What do I do? And typically that means they're not going to be there much longer, maybe a week or two, but they're going to soon abandon that den site and move on. And then October to December is dispersal. So again, this is when those older pups from previous litters might decide, I'm looking to start my own family, and so they might decide to leave. And of course, they want to do that before breeding season starts. So we'll tend to see them disperse at this time of year. Oftentimes, too, we do see an uptick in sightings at this time of year, and that can be a few factors. For one, of course, you have those individuals that are now moving. They're trying to navigate the landscape. They might be in unfamiliar territory, and they're looking to find somewhere that's unoccupied that they can then take over. And especially around here, October to December is when a lot of leaves are falling, a lot of vegetation is getting really sparse. So of course that makes it a little bit easier for us to see coyotes. So sometimes it's just kind of a misconception. People think that there are many more coyotes than there were, and it's really just that we're noticing them a little bit more. So genetics. So I mentioned that the eastern coyote is a subspecies. They're from the species just coyote, but they did originate out west. And this subspecies is a result of hybridization between various canids. And these hybridization events are no longer occurring. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. So this is just kind of the beginning of the breakdown, but there was a biologist who worked at Stony Brook University. He now lives out, he's out in California. He works at Pepperdine University, but when he was out east, he analyzed the DNA samples from 437 eastern coyotes. And he found that for the most part, these coyotes, their DNA indicated that they were 64 to about 81% coyote, but that they were actually hybrids. And so the rest of their genetic makeup was some gray wolf, some eastern wolf, and some dog. So again, these hybridization events are no longer occurring. And I said I would say it a few times, but that is because we no longer have gray wolves in the Northeast any longer. So what we're seeing is, you know, kind of somewhat of a new subspecies, but it's not this kind of freakish hybrid that people like to make us think we're seeing in our yards. So I'm going to briefly go through this, but I want to talk about common myths. I'll go through all of these, but of course I want to jump right into coy wolf. So, you know, if we were in person, I would ask you guys who has heard the term coy wolf or coy dog, and usually at least half of the people's hands go up. This is a word that we see a lot, especially from, you know, a lot of news sources. We'll frequently see it just because, you know, it's kind of a catchy word. It gets people interested, they want to click it, but the issue is that it's a little bit of a misleading word. So this word implies that the animal we're talking about, just looking at the word, is 50% coyote and 50% wolf. But again, if there are no wolves in the Northeast, that's just not possible. So it's not a term that biologists like to use because it can be so misleading and it can be incredibly confusing for people, because then they think, oh, this isn't just a coyote, it's something much more sinister. It's this large mutant creature, it's a coy wolf, and if it's in my backyard in Connecticut, I'm gonna be concerned. So it's a word that we try to steer people away from, but it's not to say that coy wolves don't exist. This image actually shows what are presumed red wolf coyote hybrids. And if any of you guys are familiar with the Wolf Conservation Center, one of the 2 endangered species we have on site is the endangered red wolf. And this would be the wolf that historically lived in our area. And unfortunately, it's a wolf that not many people are that familiar with. But again, we don't have any wolves in the Northeast. There's actually only 10 red wolves remaining in the wild, and they're in a small protected area in North Carolina. But you know, if an animal has access to its own species when it's a thriving population, they're not going to hybridize with another species. But when there are very few individuals remaining, and there might not be an eligible mate, then you might see hybridization. So that's actually one of the threats to this population's recovery. They are seeing that there are some coyote red wolf hybrids in that area in North Carolina. But again, that's not relevant to where we are. So we're trying to sort of retire the word coy wolf from people's vocabulary. Then we have this other myth, luring, and this is one that I see very frequently, especially on social media. You can imagine, as wildlife outreach specialist, I'm in a lot of nature Facebook groups and a lot of neighborhood Facebook groups, and we will see that at, you know, pretty much every mention of coyotes in someone's backyard, there is going to be a comment where someone says, bring your dogs inside, watch out, they're trying to lure your dog into the woods where the rest of the pack is waiting, and that's where they're going to kill your dog. So coyotes are very, very clever. They're very smart animals, and again, that's part of why they're so successful. But this myth goes that they send out a runner, an individual coyote, to kind of entice that dog, get them a little bit curious, and then that coyote leads them into the woods where the rest of the group is waiting to eat that dog. And although coyotes are clever, this is giving them a little bit too much credit. They're not quite that smart. They're not quite that scheming. But what we're probably seeing is just behavior that we're misinterpreting. So we have this image here of a dog chasing a coyote down a trail in San Francisco. A big takeaway point from this entire program that I want you guys to have is do not let your pets interact with wildlife. Not a good idea. It's dangerous for your pets. It's really dangerous for the wildlife. And it's just not something that we should do, regardless of how cute it might be or magical it might feel in that moment. We just do not want this to happen. So, you know, coyotes and dogs are very similar. They do have a lot of the same behavior. So it's not impossible that they're able to communicate somewhat clearly with one another, but they are behaviorally different. So last spring, I did see a video that was taken in Arizona of a coyote in someone's neighborhood and a dog that was loose in the streets, and they were playing, they were bounding after each other, you know, something out of a Disney movie. They were really chasing each other, and they seemed pretty relaxed. And the person filming it, it was not her dog, but she filmed it for about 10 minutes. And after a while, the coyote actually was comfortable enough to approach her. She ran right up to the person filming, and she was within 6 feet of her. And the woman very clearly got nervous. She started kind of banging on the metal gate next to her. She started yelling. And the coyote was pretty undeterred. She just kind of stood there looking at her. And that's really not something you want to see from wildlife. Just about 2 or 3 days later, a few blocks away, a coyote had to be put down by the local wildlife authorities because she was approaching people. And I would bet that it was the same individual. So what we're seeing there is a coyote that is far too comfortable being around people, far too comfortable being around pets, and she lost her life because of it. So it's not something that we really want to encourage at all. But let's say she, in that interaction with that dog, you know, began to feel uncomfortable, began to feel overwhelmed. Well, she might retreat to somewhere where she feels a little bit safer. And that might be somewhere where the rest of her family group is resting for the day. And so if this dog decides to follow her to that location because the dog is like, hey, we're not done playing, well, suddenly you have this large dog bursting into the midst of all these coyotes that are just trying to relax, and what they see is a threat. So they might react defensively. So we really don't want to put either of these species in this kind of position where someone could end up injured. Typically when we see interactions between large dogs and coyotes, if we have a negative interaction, it tends to be that the coyotes are interpreting that dog as a threat to their resources, as potential competition. And so again, because they're territorial, they're reacting defensively. With smaller pets, they tend to see them as potential prey. So regardless of the size of your pet or the species of your pet, we really want to make sure that we're keeping them well away from wildlife. So again, this is not a natural behavior, this luring. It's just misunderstood and kind of sensationalized behavior. And then this myth, howls create pups. This one is just so ridiculous, but I honestly can't stop talking about it. So this myth goes that if a coyote is killed, the survivors in the pack will be able to detect who has died because they can actually recognize individual howls and vocalizations. And then the females in that group will be able to then adjust their litter sizes accordingly to accommodate for those losses. So if we have any basic understanding of biology, we know that this is just not going to work. They're not magic. The female is not going to say, you know, currently I'm carrying 3 pups, but if I just think really hard, I can add 3 more to make up for the 3 adults that were just killed. That's not going to work. And if she's soon to be pregnant, she's of course not going to be able to make that kind of determination or decision either. But what we might be seeing is that if we're removing coyotes from a population, so if we take out 3 adults by killing them or relocating them or something like that, the resources that they would have had to consume, all that food, is now available. So if we do have a female in the area, either with pups or soon to have pups, she now has more access to those resources. and she might actually be able to sustain a larger litter size. They might have a higher survival rate. And it could go the other way as well. If there are too many adults in that group, and again, this is what I was talking about with them being exceptional at kind of maintaining and controlling their population size. If there are too many individuals in that area, they're not going to have enough access to resources. So you might see a lower survival in pups because they're not getting the nutrients that they need. So they're not magic. They're not hearing the howls and deciding, okay, suddenly we need to make our group larger. But I will talk about kind of our impact on their populations a little bit later as well. So switching gears a little bit, I want to talk about urban living. So when we talk about coyotes living in urban areas and cities, we tend to think of that as kind of a shocking situation. We think of cities as anti-nature, the complete opposite of nature, when in reality, there are hundreds of wild species that live in our cities. But the ability for a larger animal like a coyote to survive and thrive in that area is actually a really good indicator that it's a pretty biodiverse area and that it's somewhat healthy. Because if you imagine in a city, a coyote is the top of the food chain. They're eating a wide variety of animals. They're going to eat small mammals, so rats, mice, rabbits. They might eat some birds or eggs, the occasional insect. And of course, all of those animals have to eat to survive as well. So if you kind of imagine it as a pyramid, it really shows you that each species at each level is getting access to the resources that they need to survive. And that's a good indication of the general health of that ecosystem. So it is pretty interesting when you kind of consider that coyotes in an area could tell you that, hey, this is actually a pretty healthy ecosystem. So of course, if we have coyotes eating and living in an area, they're of course going to be pooping in an area, they're going to be leaving scat. So this is a drawing of coyote scat. I tend to sort of lose some people at this point, but you're stuck with me. So coyote scat, like I said before, is a really great way to mark territory. So we will often use these in studies. I've worked on research projects where we're collecting and analyzing and marking where we locate scat, because it tells you, for one, that this animal exists here. It's clear evidence. You can learn to, if you're so curious, you can learn to identify scat characteristics and figure out the exact species that left that scat. So for those of you who are interested, coyote scat tends to be kind of long and cylindrical. Because they're omnivores, you're going to see some bones in there. You might see some fur, and that fur tends to give it sort of a rope-like consistency, and you tend to see a tapered end. If you're out walking, and I'm sure a lot of us are kind of taking advantage of this extra time home and out walking on our local trails, you can actually, I encourage you to use a tool like a stick, but you can actually break that scat open and kind of examine what's inside. And you can find a lot of really interesting information. And if you were unsure if it was coyote versus dog, dog tends to be a little bit different in their shape, but typically our dogs are eating kibble. So it's going to be pretty uniform inside. It sort of looks like cornmeal. And then something like a bobcat, they tend to be somewhat segmented scat, and bobcats are obligate carnivores. So that means they're only eating meat. So you're only going to see fur and bones, whereas with coyotes, you might see fur, bones, insects, plant matter, a wide variety of different types of food. So this is an image of a dissected coyote scat. So this is from Los Angeles. I used to work with the National Park Service out there, and I helped out on a coyote project. I was one of their carnivore technicians, and we were examining urban coyote populations. So we enlisted a bunch of citizen scientists, so volunteers, and we trained them how to identify coyote scat. And we would assign them certain parks, urban parks, and we would give them collection kits, and they would go out periodically and locate scat and collect it and kind of mark where they found it. And then we would have what we called dissection parties. In the meantime, we were out in the mountains, in the more natural areas, and we were doing the same thing. And we wanted to compare their diets in these more natural areas versus the urban environments. So you can see this is one that's dissected. They did go through a very intense sterilization process. We did provide food at these dissection parties, and some people were comfortable eating a bagel with one hand and dissecting scat with the other hand. I was not one of those people, but you know, to each his own. Here you can see that on the left we have bones. So one example is there's that kind of plastic disc, a little cap there, and you can see, that was not from the scat sample, but you can see two objects below that. There's actually a rat jaw, and then there's kind of some shoulder blades, some ribs, and you can identify two species, which animals these coyotes are eating, which can be really interesting. And then to the right is just kind of the more fibrous material, the fur and everything like that. So Urban Coyote Initiative, they did a similar study. They analyzed 1,400 scat samples, and they found the majority of them contained small rodents, then fruit, deer, rabbit, and only about 2% had human garbage, and 1.3% had evidence of cats. So if you're math-minded, you might look at this and say that is more than 100%. And that's because, you know, some of these samples are going to have more than one thing in them. They might have rodents and fruit. So this will obviously vary based on where you take these samples. Urban areas are going to have different percentages from natural areas. Different cities might have a different kind of distribution, but this is kind of an interesting breakdown. And again, that deer is primarily going to be from scavenging or from fawns, depending on the time of year. So because I mentioned human garbage and cats, this brings me to my keys to coexistence. This is really what this whole program is all about. I like to think of these as kind of a fire drill. You obviously hope that you never have, you know, the negative situation that would warrant this kind of education. But if you're ever in that situation, you're going to be glad that you attended that class, that you're familiar with what to do. So the big one seems obvious: do not feed coyotes. A common saying is a fed coyote is a dead coyote. And that means that if we get coyotes accustomed to approaching us for food, then ultimately, like that coyote in Arizona, ultimately that's likely going to lead to their death, because they might continue approaching people, continue exhibiting what we would consider inappropriate behavior, potentially dangerous behavior, and ultimately that's going to result in them being killed. Unintentional feeding is something that we don't often think about. An example is bird seed. So a lot of us have bird feeders in our yards. They can be real fun to watch, but something we don't think about necessarily is how that might attract coyotes. So of course, if any of you do have bird feeders in your backyards, I'm sure you're very familiar with the squirrels and the chipmunks and all the little rodents and everything like that that do try to access that bird seed. So although the coyotes are not necessarily going for the bird seed, they might be lingering because the animals that they do prefer to eat, those small mammals, are congregating in your yard. So it's something to think about if you are seeing an increase in coyote behavior in your area, to maybe limit the bird seed, make sure you're picking it up as it falls to the ground, keeping those areas clean, maybe getting a seed catcher, but really trying to make sure that we're not continuing to have an attractant in our yards. Fallen fruit, many people have ornamental fruit trees, so when that fruit does fall to the ground, we want to make sure that we're just picking it up promptly. We're not letting it rot on the ground, because again, that's going to attract those small mammals. But coyotes will eat fallen fruit, so they might be there for the animals they're hunting, but they could also be there just for the fruit itself. And then pet food. We don't want to leave pet food outdoors. We don't see this too much, but you know, if we have indoor-outdoor cats, which I will talk about in a moment, we want to make sure that we're not leaving more food than they can handle, or leaving food out for a long period of time. And we definitely want to make sure we're not feeding the neighborhood raccoons and opossums. As much as we love them, we all want to be Snow White, but again, we are acclimating them to us, and we are leaving out this constant attractant for these other animals. We want to secure our garbage, compost, and recycling. So garbage and recycling, that tends to be, you know, if there's a lot of coyote activity, then we want to make sure that even though many of them won't be able to get into our garbage cans, we don't want to leave that attractant, all those smells out for them to really linger. So just putting those things out morning of pickup. Compost, that might mean securing it or fencing around it, just so it's not attracting animals. Because again, coyotes aren't very picky, and that's just rotting food garbage in there. And so we don't want it to be a source of an attractant, although I do encourage you to compost. Do not leave pets outdoors unsupervised. So this is dogs in our yards. So tying our dogs out, letting them roam off leash. Even if we have fences, sometimes people get a little bit complacent with fences because they think, oh, they're contained, no animals are going to come in, but coyotes can actually hop 5-foot fences. They're great climbers. So, and if your fence doesn't reach the ground or go underground, it's not impossible for them to squeeze under or dig under. So sometimes we do see that people get a little bit complacent when they do have fencing, and we just want to encourage people to supervise your pets. And again, I mentioned indoor, outdoor cats. So as grim as it is, when we let our cats outdoors, we are re-entering them into the food chain. So that means that they are susceptible to becoming prey, and they're also, of course, preying on other animals. So even though we think that our individual cats are not necessarily hunters, cats are actually responsible for billions of animals being killed outdoors every single year. And cats here are the non-native species. So we really want to make sure that we're keeping our cats indoors. This always makes me sound like I don't like cats. I have foster kittens in the room behind me. I'm a big cat person, but we really want to make sure that we're keeping our pets as safe as we can possibly keep them. And then if something does unfortunately happen to them, we have to kind of examine, you know, what our role was. If we were letting those cats outside, we can't really blame an animal for potentially seeing them as prey. Coyotes aren't walking around with a wildlife identification book in their pockets. They don't know which species are appropriate to eat and which are not. And then water sources. We tend to see this more in drier climates, but if you are seeing a lot of coyote activity, if you just kind of cut off access to, if you have a small, you know, koi pond or something like that in your yard, just trying to limit something that might attract them, but that doesn't tend to be as big of an issue in our areas. So this is an image that I really love. So it doesn't look like much right now, but what we're seeing here are data points from 2 collared coyotes. So these coyotes had GPS collars on, and I will talk about GPS collars a little bit more, but GPS collars are they're a really great research tool, and they monitor their location. So periodically throughout the day, and it depends on the settings, but typically, you know, maybe 6 times a day, this GPS collar will take a data point and send it to a biologist, and it'll start to appear on a map like we're seeing here. So over time, you can look at all these individual data points and you can analyze them and figure out territory size. You can figure out if they're interacting with other animals that are collared. Maybe they're lingering more near roads. Maybe they're crossing rivers. You can learn a lot about them. You can learn about their survival. So what we're seeing here, and you can kind of ignore the colors of these dots and lines, that just tells you what time of day these points were taken. But what we're looking at is about 6 weeks worth of data. And you can see there's a big GPS cluster of points kind of towards the north, and then a smaller cluster a little bit south. So the researchers looking at this, and this was in Rhode Island, they went up to the north kind of cluster, and it was a home, and they found that the homeowners were actually feeding coyotes deliberately. So they issued a warning, and they said, you have to stop doing that. Then they went to the southernmost site, took a slightly different approach, and they just asked them, hey, why do you think there's so much coyote activity around here? So then 3 to 5 weeks later, this is what that same exact map looked like. So what happened was those homeowners, both of them were feeding the coyotes. They removed those attractants, those easy food sources, and the coyotes, within 3 to 5 weeks, learned that quickly, and they stopped visiting those areas. So that really shows you how our behaviors influence theirs and how quickly they learn. So if they learn there's no longer a food source here, it's not worth my time, they're going to leave that area. So I think that's a really clear sign of how what we do can really change what they do. So conflict. I'm talking about all of this, of course, because we want to minimize conflict. And studies have shown that all of these preventative measures that I'm going to talk about going forward are the best way to reduce conflict. Of course, we don't want conflict with coyotes. This is all about trying to find the best ways to coexist with them. So I want to go through some terminology. So first is a sighting. This is just coyotes observed or heard in an area. Finding scat would also fall under this. So this is just evidence that coyotes exist. Encounters are coyotes following or approaching a person with or without pets, or entering a yard without people present. So I want to emphasize without people present. If you're, in your kitchen and you happen to see a coyote in your yard from your window, something like that, that's not really a cause for concern. But if you're out gardening and you're very obvious and a coyote does approach, that's a little bit more concerning, and I'll talk about that. And then conflict. Conflict can come in various different forms, and I'm going to go through each of these. So first we have an unattended pet attack. And this is when a coyote injures or kills an unattended or unleashed pet. So again, this might be a pet in a yard, an outdoor cat, an off-leash dog. So this is obviously very upsetting. It is always tragic when something like this happens, but you can understand a little bit more why something like this might happen. An attended pet attack is when a coyote injures or kills a pet on leash or off leash and under visual observation and voice control. So there's a person there, and the coyote is still comfortable enough to approach. That is obviously something we really don't want to see. That's much more concerning. A provoked human attack. A coyote biting a human when the human's feeding the coyote, approaching an animal with pups, or intervening during a pet attack or similar interaction. And this should always be reported to the police immediately. I do want to talk about approaching an animal with pups, especially given the season that we're kind of entering right now. So I'd mentioned that it's pupping season. Oftentimes at this time of year, we hear more reports of people out maybe on a hike, and they see a coyote, and the coyote appears to be following them, and not necessarily aggressive or stalking, but just kind of plodding along behind them. And understandably, that's a little concerning. It's kind of unusual. But what is likely happening in that scenario is that you as a walker have approached a coyote den without realizing it. And sometimes these coyote dens they might be closer to trails than you might think, or maybe in someone's yard, something like that. And so what that adult coyote is doing is trying to distract you. They're perceiving you as a potential threat to their pups because they think, their pups are very vulnerable, and it's oftentimes other animals will prey on them. So they're kind of evaluating whether you might be one of those potential predators. So what they're doing is escorting you away. They're saying, hey, look at me, I'm over here. Isn't this kind of unusual? And trying to distract you. So if you were seeking out that den site, which we're not, then you would be distracted and you would probably wander away from that den because they're leading you away. So what you would do in this situation is, you would go back the way you came, or continue away from that animal. If you're with a small dog, you can certainly pick them up, you could make noise, but you would just want to kind of calmly leave that area, and sort of make it clear that you're not a threat. So, you just kind of get out of that area. You wouldn't want to run, just remove yourself from the situation as best as possible. But that's likely what we're seeing in these situations, and that becomes kind of a common report. And nothing ever seems to happen. It's just, this coyote was following me, and it was pretty unnerving. Okay, and the next one. So this is an unprovoked human attack. So a coyote bites a human without provocation, should be reported to the police immediately. So the unfortunate thing is I can't provide much comfort for that one. And that, of course, is the scariest possibility out of all of these. So what we're often seeing in these unprovoked human attacks is a sick animal, a coyote that might have rabies or distemper, and I can't predict what their behavior is going to be. They might be a little bit more desperate, a little bit more delirious. So if we're seeing an animal that's exhibiting signs of illness, stumbling, being uncharacteristically bold, things like that, you would, of course, call the police. But I really can't provide a whole lot of guidance for that in these situations, unfortunately. Oftentimes, too, what we're seeing in unprovoked human attacks is, again, an animal that's being fed nearby. So they're associating people with food. There might be a neighbor 2 houses down that's hand feeding these coyotes, and the coyote starts to associate people in general with a food source. So they might start to approach every house, every person they see looking for a handout. And when that person doesn't, excitedly hand them food, then that could result in a bad situation. So again, this is all about doing the right thing. We're not feeding coyotes, and we're encouraging everyone to kind of respond appropriately as well. So hazing coyotes. So this is how we prepare for these other coyotes. What we want to do is reinforce their natural wariness. So coyotes are naturally very fearful of us, but again, sometimes they can unlearn that fear, but they're really smart. So they can learn, even if we have a coyote that's getting a little bit bolder, they can relearn that people are alarming, that we're unpredictable, that we're loud and we're strange and unfamiliar, and that's what we want to do with hazing. So this is loud sounds, exaggerated motions. We want to just discourage them from lingering around us, our houses, our yards. So varied hazing is most effective. Basically what we want to do is, wave our arms in the air, shout weird things. You can carry a whistle with you on your walks. A really easy at-home tool you can make is take a soda can and fill it with pennies or uncooked beans or something like that. Tape the top closed, and then you can shake that and rattle it. And it can be a very alarming noise. Certainly if someone shook that in a room that I was standing in, I would want to leave immediately. And that's a really lightweight thing and kind of cheap tool that you can make at home. But again, whistles are really lightweight. They make little pocket-sized air horns. These are all just things that, you could have with you to feel more comfortable, to feel more prepared. And you don't want to be the only one hazing. So this is why it's so great to have these kind of community-wide programs, because we don't want just one person in that area being the only person hazing, because coyotes might learn, all right, well, we're just going to avoid that person's yard. We might go in the next one looking for some snacks over there. And so if we're all hazing coyotes, they will start to learn. We want to do it frequently, we want to do it consistently, and they will start to learn that people in general are just something that they should stay away from. If they're really far away, you don't need to haze them, but if they do start to approach, then you certainly do want to haze them. I love observing coyotes, but I have certainly hazed them. I've had them kind of approach when they just don't see me. If I'm standing at the edge of a field and they're out there and they're just kind of going on their merry way. And once they start heading in my direction, I start yelling and making noise, and they see me and bolt. So as much as I'd love to continue watching them, I do want them to stay safe, and I want them to start to associate people with something startling and something uncomfortable. And if we have a coyote that's sick or injured or suspected of any of those, we want to make sure that we're calling your local wildlife kind of agency or calling law enforcement, and they'll come out and assess it. You don't want to haze an animal like that because, again, they could be disoriented, and we don't want to kind of add more of an issue to the situation. So talking about conflict brings me to talking about the stigma against coyotes. And I'm sure some of us are here because we're pretty wary of coyotes. We might not like coyotes, and that's okay. But a lot of these conflict things and, the way we talk about coyotes in the media can really contribute to this stigma. So this is a slogan, save a deer, shoot a coyote. And for one, I don't think this is particularly catchy, but it's also not accurate. So what this implies is that, that for one, our deer population is in danger, and that the coyotes have an impact on that population. Again, there is no real evidence that coyotes are killing adult deer. And if they are, they're killing deer that are already injured, that they're already going to unfortunately go down soon. So this is a little bit of misinformation here. And around here, of course, our population of white-tailed deer has no natural predators. So as much as I love deer, what we're seeing is an incredible lack of balance. So because they have no natural predators, their population has been able to kind of grow past carrying capacity of the environment. They will eat everything they can possibly reach. So next time you guys are out for a walk, I encourage you to really take a good look at the forest understory if you have access to woods. And you'll notice that what should be a really thick, lush understory, so basically all the vegetation up to 6 to 8 feet, that's kind of the understory. It should be really thick and lush, and oftentimes it's really, really sparse. You can see for a pretty long distance. A lot of animals really depend on that understory. A lot of birds, a lot of small mammals, that's their preferred habitat. But when we have too many deer and they're over browsing an area, they kind of decimate all of that vegetation because it's everything that they can possibly reach, and they're removing that habitat and those food sources for all these other animals that really depend on it. But if we did have other animals like wolves or mountain lions in the area kind of maintaining that balance, you wouldn't see as much of an impact. So this again implies that coyotes are having an enormous impact on deer, but they're not. They're trying to kind of preserve these deer so that they can hunt them in deer season. So wildlife killing contests. This is something that a lot of places will use as kind of, weekend-long event. And And they'll be species specific sometimes. It might be squirrels, it might be raccoons, bobcats, foxes. So this is one from a coyote hunt from New York State last year. I don't have the flyer for this year, but I do have an article about it. So oftentimes these contests will have prizes for the hunter that kills the most coyotes, or in this case, the heaviest. I've seen flyers from contests where hunters will get prizes for killing the smallest coyote. They'll really vary. So Connecticut, I believe, has an open season for coyotes. So that means day or night, any time of day, year round, people are permitted to kill coyotes with the proper license and everything like that. But that means pups, that means pregnant females. There's no discrimination. Whatever that hunter wants to kill, they're permitted to do year round. New York State, the hunting season is only 6 months of the year. So there is a little bit of breathing room, but really not much. Again, you're still going to be getting pups that are just a few months old, things like that. So again, I'm going on a tangent a little bit, but we have $2,000 grand prize for the hunter with the heaviest coyote, second heaviest. We even have an extra prize for the female hunter, so we have a little bit of sexism rolled in here. This past year in New York State, the winner in Sullivan County turned in a 50.3 pound female, so again, above average. He took home the grand prize because he also killed another heaviest coyote on Sunday and 3 more coyotes. So the prize for each coyote killed was $80. The entry fee for the contest was only $35. Sometimes there will be cash prizes, sometimes it'll be equipment, guns, things like that. And this was a record. 118 coyotes were killed at this event. So you can imagine if you have an area, maybe a few counties wide, and you're encouraging people to come in and kill as many coyotes as possible, because the incentive here is you're getting money. So you're going to kill as many coyotes as possible and hope that you're going to get the heaviest one for that day. So what this is doing is encouraging a bloodbath, and it's also being touted as a management method. Again, that they're protecting the deer populations and that they're preventing these coyote populations from getting out of control. And that is just not accurate. You know, if you're killing all these animals, as many as you possibly can, that's really not an appropriate management technique. And here's why. So this tells you why killing coyotes doesn't work. And this does say killing, but I think this kind of applies to removal in general. So oftentimes people ask for, agencies, don't kill them. Why don't you just relocate them to an area? And it still has the same impact on those individuals. So here we have a stable pack. We have the alpha pair. Those kind of orange pups would be the pups from that year. It's kind of a small litter. And then the other pink and blue pups, or coyotes, are, previous offspring from previous years. Then when we go in and we start indiscriminately killing these coyotes, what happens is you completely disrupt that pack structure. So we have that female, and she's now breeding with this green coyote, so a coyote that came in from outside the area. And they're now having a larger litter size because, again, adults have been removed from that population. So there's more access to those resources that I talked about before. So they might have more pups in a given year. They might have a higher survival rate. So larger litter sizes. Then we have a purple and green coyote down here. So 2 individuals that are not from this area. They're now coming in and they're breeding. They're also having a large litter size. And then we have another pink and blue. So pups or coyotes from that area. They're starting to breed. Maybe one of her pups and another outside individual, they're starting to breed. So what you're seeing is you originally had that one stable pack, you had that one breeding pair, and now you have more breeding pairs, larger litter sizes. So though you might see a temporary dip in those numbers, you see an ultimate boom in that population, and that's called the rebound effect. So this really shows that it just doesn't have any kind of impact in the way that people intend on these coyote populations. And if we're talking about relocating coyotes, oftentimes what happens is you remove that individual, you're now putting them in an area that's unfamiliar to them. They might either try to navigate back to their familiar territory and likely get killed along the way, either crossing roads, or they might get killed by resident coyotes because now they're trespassing in another territory. So what we want to do is encourage our resident coyotes to kind of behave appropriately. And we do that through hazing. Those coyotes are going to exclude other coyotes from the area because they are territorial. So if you have coyotes that are kind of behaving, they're not causing any issues, they're not considered a threat to the health of the people in the area, you want to protect those coyotes. You want those coyotes to stay because they're going to teach those lessons to their pups, and they're going to exclude those other coyotes from the outside the area that might behave inappropriately. So I know I'm talking for a really long time. I'm going to try to go through the rest of this as quickly as possible. So again, I mentioned that in all of these urban areas, there are typically coyotes. So many places are going to have studies focused on those coyotes and kind of examining how they're surviving in these areas, how they're using the landscape. So I mentioned Urban Coyote Initiative. We have Focus on Wildlife in Cleveland. I mentioned LA Urban Coyote Project, which I worked on. Gotham Coyote Project is like Westchester and some of New York City. And so these are just a few examples of different research projects. So what researchers are typically going to do is they want to mark these coyotes. I just like to get people kind of familiar with what you would do in one of these research projects because, you know, you might see an image like this and, you know, think it's so cruel, but it's actually a really great way to study the overall population and learn about individual and population survival. So ear tagging is a good example, a way to mark an individual so you can identify them later. And this is a good way to identify them without having to recapture them. Captures can be very stressful, and sometimes they can be very difficult to, once you've gotten a coyote once, they become what's called trap smart or trap wise, and they might not want to be captured again. You also get some animals that become trap happy and they just keep going back into the traps. But anyway, this one has, you know, yellow, and a yellow ear tag in the left ear, a red in the right. So if she walked through someone's backyard and they called it in, a biologist could look through their records and say, oh, that individual, we tagged her 2 years ago, 3 counties away. These were her parents. And now we know she's dispersed all this way. She now lives over here. She's survived this long. So you can learn a lot of information about them that way. Radio collars I mentioned. So I talked about GPS collars. We have this coyote in this image, which is also taken on a trail camera, wearing a GPS collar. And again, those are going to take GPS points and periodically check in. There's another type of collar called VHF collars, and that stands for very high frequency. And it's a little bit different in that you actually need a person out in the field monitoring that animal. So that's what I'm doing in this image, tracking a mountain lion. And I'm listening with that antenna and I'm listening for a beeping signal. And I'll hear that when I'm within a certain range. And I basically, you can see I'm on top of a mountain and I would spin around until I pinpoint where I'm hearing the signal from loudest. And then I would pull out a map, I would pull out a compass, and I would take a bearing and plot it on a map. And then I would do it a few times. So each of these open circles indicates a place where I was standing. In these cases, I was lucky, I was right off the road. And the line indicates where I heard the signal loudest. And once I do that, I go to a different location. And eventually my lines will intersect and I get a triangle. So it's called triangulation. This photo on the right, you can see those white lines are roads. So this mountain lion was likely sitting in someone's backyard. And then trail cameras I mentioned before, but again, this is a great non-invasive way to monitor wildlife. So that means you don't have to capture them. But of course it can be difficult to distinguish individuals, although these two are pretty clear. So we have, these are some coyotes that live just in the woods around the Wolf Conservation Center. So on the left is a male, on the right is his mate, a female. She's one of the blonde ones I mentioned. So this is something that you can use in your backyard. You can get these at pretty affordable prices, and they can be a lot of fun to really see what animals are using the area and you might not even realize. So I like to end this on kind of a positive note. So, you know, I don't really like to assign value to animals just based on how we benefit from them, but I do think it's important to have these talking points and really understand why coyotes are such important members of this kind of ecosystem team, the ecosystem services that they provide. So for one, they're scavengers. So they clean up the environment. If we didn't have scavengers, and scavengers get a really bad rep, but if we didn't have scavengers, we'd be up to our necks in carcasses, which I know sounds disgusting and horrifying, and we would not be able to function, we would not be able to survive. So scavengers like coyotes and raccoons and opossums and vultures, they're really, really important animals, and they will clean up a dead animal very, very quickly. Coyotes encourage biodiversity, so they control mesopredator populations. So mesopredators are, again, raccoons, opossums, foxes, and these are animals that will sometimes prey on bird nests or songbirds. But when we have coyotes, you know, kind of a step above them in the food chain, maintaining that balance, they allow these animals to survive a little bit longer and encourage a lot of that biodiversity. So we do see a lot of songbirds. They help prevent the spread of Lyme disease, of course, so they're eating these small mammals, these rats and mice that we know carry Lyme disease. Again, so they're preventing the spread of those diseases, so Lyme and other zoonotic diseases. Of course, many people don't want to live around rats and mice, so rodent populations are controlled. Again, it's all about maintaining that balance. And then just a little bit more sentimentally, coyote packs are families. Their family structure really is not all that different from our own. And again, they really do work together, and they have been known to actually grieve when individuals in their family groups disappear or are killed. They have shown very clear, distinct grieving behaviors. They have incredibly strong social bonds. So what we can do, this is what we're all about here. The best thing you can do if you like coyotes, and I really hope you like coyotes, but I do understand if you don't, the best thing you can do, keep their fear of humans intact. It's the best thing for them. It's the best thing for us. Again, I said I love coyotes, but I will haze them. We want to encourage their wariness. The best thing you can do if you don't like coyotes, keep their fear of humans intact. It's really the best thing for them. And again, these studies have shown that hazing coyotes, encouraging them to stay away from us, is going to be the best way to reduce instances of conflict. So we have to learn to coexist. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to go back to where I can see you guys. You can see me. Okay. And if you guys have any questions, let me scroll through the chat. Okay. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat over there. Or if you want to type them in the Q&A, again, the Q&A is anonymous, so the other attendees can't see your question. But hopefully you guys have some questions. If not, I am going to type my email address in here again. So if you do think of them later, feel free to send me an email. Are coyotes attracted to wild turkeys that might be nearby? It's certainly possible. Turkeys are, you know, it's a lot of food for coyotes. They do tend to go after typically smaller animals, but turkeys might be kind of easy for coyotes to catch. So they will certainly go after coyotes. Bobcats certainly will too. So it's very possible that turkeys are an attractant. When I hear howling around 8 to 9 p.m., what is going on? Good question. So again, coyotes are, you know, primarily crepuscular, so they're most active at dawn and dusk. And now that the days are getting a little bit longer, 8 to 9 is kind of when they might start being a little bit more active, because of course we're going inside, we're not around as much, there's a little bit more wildlife activity going on. So howling can be a really good way to, you know, regroup. Even though they're kind of these family structures, they might not be spending all day every day with each other. So howling is a good way to say, hey, I'm over here, let's meet up. It's also a really good way to advertise to other coyotes that, again, this area is occupied. So howling tells coyotes nearby that this is a territory that there are coyotes active in, and that they should stay away. So it can be a lot of different things. And actually, I believe I want to say it's Urban Coyote Initiative. They have a really great, if you just Google something about coyote howls, what do they mean? There's a really great source that kind of analyzes all of their different vocalizations. So howls, bark howls, yip howls, and you can kind of figure out the different things that they might be communicating. It can be really interesting. A coyote seeming to chase my client on a bike on a trail was probably because he got close to a den. It's very likely. Of course, I can't say for sure, but I think it's certainly likely that a coyote was pursuing someone on a bike because he might have unintentionally gotten a little too close to a den. You're, of course, you know, moving fast. You might be moving kind of like prey. I will say it's a little bit unusual for them to chase a biker. But again, that's why I say, you know, you don't want to run. If a coyote is too close to you, you just want to be as large as possible, as intimidating as possible. As a biker, that's going to be hard because you're not going to want to stop your bike for a coyote. But that's my best guess, is that your client got a little bit too close. Is it a myth that there's a lot of howling when they've made a kill? Yeah, that seems to be a myth, and that is a pretty common one. People will often say, oh, I heard that they made a kill. They were howling so much. And I mean, coyotes are primarily going after the small prey. So it wouldn't be too wise to call in the entire family, because if they've just killed a mouse, they're going to eat it in one bite. So that's not something that really seems to have actually that much weight to it. But again, it can be something more social. With wolves, we'll see that howling is often kind of referred to as social glue. So sometimes it just doesn't seem to have a functional purpose, but it might be just reinforcing those social bonds. It's kind of like us singing around a campfire. It's a good way for them to maintain their different rankings in their group, and to really just kind of regroup as a family. Could my dog have been bitten by a coyote in December? 65-pound Airedale Terrier. Actually, that video that I mentioned in Arizona, that was an Airedale Terrier. Dog had a wound, but could have been playing with the other dog. Live in the middle of nowhere. It's possible. I'd say any bite on your pet that you can identify, always a good idea to bring them to the vet. This is, of course, why we want our pets to be vaccinated. That's a great way to help eradicate rabies. And there was, there had decades ago been a big rabies problem, but then with kind of the removal of stray dogs, loose dogs, and making rabies vaccinations be legally mandated, that kind of encouraged a real drop-off in instances of rabies. So I'm not going to say it's impossible that it was a coyote that bit your dog, but I will say there's no way to really know, and it's certainly possible that it was just kind of a little tiff with your other dog. Will coyotes take my dog's toys from the yard? I found dog toys out of my yard where I've seen coyotes. I love this question, because there have been videos of coyotes actually playing with dog toys in the yard. And that would actually be a fun way to use a trail camera. You could, attach it to lawn furniture or something like that, and really see if coyotes will take these toys. So even coyotes that have lived in the wild their whole life, they play. So it's definitely possible that a coyote did borrow your dog's toy and toss it around in the night. Okay, so how big is the average range of a pack? Is there any overlap of their territory? So territory size really varies. So a lot of studies have shown, and this is another reason that these GPS collars can be really important. It's one of the ways that we really learn a lot of this information, because otherwise it's somewhat anecdotal. But GPS collars, you can really see on a map that, this coyote's territory is here, this one is right here, and you might see a little bit of overlap. But for the most part, there are kind of pretty strict delineations. And because coyotes are monogamous, you're not going to see them really wandering into other animals' territories. Whereas an animal like a mountain lion, what you would typically see is, and again, we don't have any mountain lions in the Northeast either, unfortunately, but you would typically see, female territories, and then you would see male territories spanning a lot of those female territories. But since coyotes are monogamous, you're just going to see pretty condensed territories. And they've found that in urban areas, those territory sizes will be smaller, so they might be confined to a park or a few blocks. And one of the reasons they're smaller is because they have a higher abundance of resources, which might seem counterintuitive, but where there are people, there are rodents, there's going to be rabbits. So that's a ton of food for these coyotes, and they don't really need to have a bigger territory, because everything that they could possibly need is in that small area. So it really does vary. It could be as small as a 1 square mile, to in more rural areas, it might be as big as, 15 square miles. Do you recommend the spiked vests for small dogs? So if you guys aren't familiar, there have been these kind of inventions to prevent coyote attacks on small pets. So one of these things is kind of a harness that goes over your dog, and it has what look like porcupine spikes, and they're usually fun colors. They look like little punk rock dogs. They're pretty hilarious, and they do actually seem to deter coyote attacks. Again, I think it's really important that we're keeping our pets supervised, but what they do is they make it so, this is a little grim, but they make it so a coyote just can't get purchased, because if they try to bite they're just hit in the face with these spikes and there's nowhere to grab on, and it's just unpleasant and probably painful. So just like it would work on a porcupine, it's going to work on your small pet. So it's certainly something that you can consider. And if you are seeing in your neighborhood that there are these really bold coyotes, it is certainly going to provide peace of mind, and I think it would definitely help. But of course, it does only cover their torso, so you would just have to really be vigilant. But hopefully we're not seeing coyotes that are too bold. What's the state of the overall coyote population? Are there threats of endangerment? No, there are no threats of coyotes going endangered anytime soon. Although, of course, remember, it is important that we maintain this balance that we're talking about. We don't want to completely decimate these populations. I didn't mention it before, but when I had that chart up that showed why killing coyotes doesn't work, one of the reasons it really doesn't work is because you would have to remove 75% of that coyote population for years in a row for it to have any real impact on the overall population of that area. So that's impossible to do. And that's one of the reasons that these other methods, these preventative methods, are really the better thing to do. And if we're removing these coyotes from an area, other coyotes are coming in. We create what's called a vacuum. So what we really want to do is just encourage our kind of well-behaved coyotes to do the right thing. In hazing, is there anything you should not do, i.e. that might encourage an attack? I mentioned running. I would say probably don't run. But, you know, I can't predict what every single individual coyote is going to do. Of course, this just applies generally. There are going to be coyotes that are warier than others. Some might be just naturally more bold, just like we see in people, just like we see in pets. They might have the same exact upbringing, but you're going to see those different kind of personality types. So just across the board, the thing you want to do is be as loud as possible, be as strange as possible. Just basically look like, hey, I'm going to put up a good fight if you really actually truly consider this, which they're not. So I would say there's probably nothing you shouldn't do. I mean, you could get as wild as possible. You can take pots and pans and bang them together. You can yell really crazy things. One thing that in kids programs I encourage is say like, hey, coyote, I appreciate you, but get out of here. Just yell as loud as you want. But there's nothing that off the top of my head I would say you shouldn't do. How do foxes and coyotes interact? So they tend to kind of avoid one another for the most part. In some locations, you might see that coyotes will kill gray foxes because they're a little bit smaller than red foxes. Around here, we have more red foxes than we have gray foxes. But for the most part, it seems like they don't even really compete all that much. Of course, they are going after a lot of the same prey species, so it's not impossible that they would feel a little bit competitive towards one another, but it doesn't seem like they have too many negative interactions. And just anecdotally, of course, this is not actual data, but in my trail cameras, I'll see them within a minute of one another, within 30 seconds of one another. So they're fully aware that the other animal is around. And, you know, they don't seem to have any kind of negative interaction that way. Is most everything you've said the same for the coyotes in Los Angeles? It seems to be somewhat across the board. Of course, again, a lot of this will change depending on outdoor cat populations. You might see, you know, if there's a ton of outdoor cats, then maybe they're going to become a higher percentage of their diets. But for the most part, it does seem like coyotes really aren't eating that many cats, but that is not to say that we should let our pets outside. Yeah, it seems to be that in a lot of these areas, I mean, if we're talking about Los Angeles as a city, you know, LA kind of proper, then that's a pretty different makeup from what New York City would be, because it is still somewhat residential. So a lot of this will kind of overlap, but, you know, you're going to have regional differences. I've only seen a solitary coyote. Is that typical, or do they usually move as packs? I'd say that's pretty typical. Oftentimes it might just be that they're an individual, they might be in pairs. It's possible that all their offspring kind of struck out on their own, or that unfortunately they didn't survive. But oftentimes, you know, we might see one coyote, but maybe a few hundred yards behind is the other one. They'll be traveling with each other, but not necessarily next to one another. But sometimes they do just go out on their own because, of course, they're going after these small mammals. And so that's really only enough food to feed about one. Let's see. Okay, so I have a question about coy wolves. So yes, I did talk about this. I do encourage you to email me. I can certainly reiterate it, but coy wolves, so I said that it is a term that we don't really like to use as scientists because we don't have any wolves in the Northeast. So the term coy wolf or coy dog, it implies that these hybridization events are still occurring and they're not occurring any longer. So when we talk about coyotes in this area, they're just eastern coyotes. Coy wolves, the word coy wolf kind of makes people think that we have this freakish creature in our yard, and it's really just not an accurate term. So it is something that people throw around, and oftentimes they'll post a picture and say, I saw this coyote in my backyard, and people will comment and say, no, that's a coy wolf. And it's like, well, they're not, they're all kind of the same animal. So eastern coyotes are a makeup of primarily coyote, and then you have a little bit of wolf and dog DNA in there. But again, those hybridization events are no longer occurring, so we just call them eastern coyotes. Well, thank you. What's the best way to for people to support your efforts at the Wolf Conservation Center? I really appreciate that. So donations. So the Wolf Conservation Center runs exclusively off of donations and grants. We don't get any state or federal funding, even though we are part of these federal recovery programs. So I encourage you to kind of browse around on our website, always, with any organization that you support, even if you can't support them financially, one big thing you can do is interacting with their social media posts. So liking them, sharing them, commenting them, that really kind of works with the algorithm and gets more people to see them. And that of course helps with donations. Right now, with everything going on with COVID-19, in an effort to kind of help out these schools that are now switching to online learning, we've been providing programs free of charge for schools throughout the country. And actually we've gotten some international requests, which is exciting. But we are all about community. So we're trying to do this free, but we have of course closed through the end of June for now. So that is somewhat of a financial toll. So if you're able, we always appreciate donations, but even just word of mouth, I mean, that is enormous in getting people to really support these organizations that you care about. Okay, I see some in the Q&A, so I want to make sure that I'm getting everyone. Can you have two dens close to each other? I swear I have one in the woods behind my house and another across the street. I can hear howling on both sides. So that could be the same group. It could also be, coyotes moving around. And sometimes these dens, dens for coyotes can be a hole in the ground. Every once in a while, they'll repurpose a den from another animal. It can be sort of cave-like. We've seen coyote dens in tree trunks. So they can look like all kinds of different things. So what might look like a den could actually be a den of another animal. It could be a groundhog den, a fox den. And then the howling on all sides is probably just them traveling around. But sometimes, coyotes might have more than one den. Maybe they'll get disturbed at one den site and they'll have to move their pups to make sure that they're safe. So we might see, one day we're seeing coyotes here, and then suddenly the next week, it seems like they're way over there, and that could just be that something happened and they decided to move. What types of locations attract coyotes for dens? Again, that's going to vary too. But, typically it'll be, I think it seems like the preferred den sites are holes in the ground because they can really dig them out to be whatever size they need. But, locations, we'll sometimes see them in people's backyards. If you have a ton of dense shrubbery and you're seeing a lot of coyote activity, then you can kind of clear that out and make it a little less appealing for them. But they do seem to tend towards more natural areas, although, sometimes we'll see them in parks and things like that. But again, this all makes it sound like coyotes are really all that, they're present and that they might be a threat. The thing is, coyotes are all around us and the majority of us never see them. So that really shows you that, I mean, I don't know about Connecticut, but in New York State, it's probably 20,000, maybe more coyotes in the state. that really doesn't sound like that much to me when I say it out loud, but and that's just a number off the top of my head as well. I don't want that to sound like fact, but most of us never see coyotes. Even me, when I'm out looking for them, I don't see coyotes. So that really shows you that they want nothing to do with us. It's just these occasional instances where these sightings or these encounters get a little bit over-reported. Are hunters terrible people or the worst people, and what can good people do to stop them? So coyote hunting is likely always going to happen, but you can protest wildlife killing contests. So on our website, we do have, I believe there is still a link up there for protesting New York State coyote killing contests. You can reach out to your local government and tell them that, you know, you absolutely want to make sure that this isn't happening, especially when we're seeing towns start to hire trappers and contractors to remove coyotes. If we know that's not going to work, what we need to do is increase education. And I mean, these programs, these coyote programs are offered free of charge. So if you're not necessarily from Weston and you want to schedule another one, or if we want to do another one for Weston, then we can certainly schedule these and just kind of increase that education and get people to understand that, you know, removal is just not the way forward. It's just not going to work. And then the average habitat size of a coyote, we kind of covered this, but it will really vary, and it can be as small as 1 square mile to 15, 20 square miles, depending on availability of resources. So again, larger habitat sizes tend to be in rural areas, smaller tend to be in more urban areas. But again, like I mentioned before, with them regulating their population size, if we have coyotes in a small urban park and they start breeding and there's suddenly not enough food because they have all these adults that need to eat and they've decimated the rodent population, then you're going to see that they're going to start to die off. So that's called carrying capacity, and you'll often see these patterns where they kind of follow the rise and fall of prey availability. So that really shows you that these population sizes can't exponentially grow. They're just not going to be supported in that area. Okay. Eastern coyote DNA is comprised of coyote, wolf, and dog. How does the DNA differ in other genuses of coyotes? Off the top of my head, to be completely honest, I do not know. But it seems like in other areas, there is not really hybridization. There are about, I believe it's 19 accepted subspecies of coyotes. So it will change kind of regionally, but we don't really see quite as much hybridization in these other subspecies. And the reason I focus on Eastern is because, of course, those are the coyotes around here, but they're also the coyotes that people tend to be most fearful of because of that hybridization and because of the word coy wolf and things like that. So hopefully that's everyone's questions. I'm just checking back in the Q&A. I believe I got all of those. So I know we've gone a little bit long. I'm so sorry about that. But I'm always happy to answer more questions. If you guys do think of them, feel free to email me. I'll put my email in here one more time since we've had a lot of questions since then. But yeah, if you guys think of anything, then feel free to reach out and I'm happy to discuss more. But thank you guys so much for attending. This was really great. This was a huge turnout and I really, really appreciate it. So enjoy the outdoors. Don't be afraid of coyotes. They're our friends, but our distant friends. We're all familiar with what that's like now. All right. Have a good night, everybody. Stay safe. Bye.